lecture in our Ideas Matter Under Religion and Culture Endowment series for this year, which is entitled Healings and Hurtings, Religion, Self, and the Body. And my name is Courtney Campbell. I'm a professor in the School of History, Philosophy, and Religion. And one of the reasons we're really excited to start this series this year is about 3 weeks ago, the state system approved a new major in religious studies. And so those of you that are searching for majors, we'd like to have one by the end of the month or something like that. Anyway, we're really kind of excited about that. We also have, this will be a second lecture this week on Thursday by Mary Vasquez of the University of Florida, and it'll be in the same place at 7 o'clock. There's a flyer in the back and actually several brochures that our publicity coordinator Bob Pecknell has brought in. So several items at the back we hope you take advantage of. But just wanted to welcome you all out this evening. Hope that some of the other lectures in this series you'll be able to attend. We're really quite excited about the people that are participating this year. With that, I'll turn it over to my colleague, Amy Hellinger, who's very much sort of the intellectual force behind this particular series. You are.
Well, I want to thank you all for being here, and I'm just so pleased to have Ariel Glucklich here with us. So, as I've been working on religion and boxing, bodily experience has been such a central part of what I do. And very early on, Ariel's work became very helpful to me in thinking through exactly what the experience of boxing was and how it fit into religious worlds. And so I'm a long time, you know this, I'm a long time admirer of your work. So it's just been really wonderful to have you here for a day. So let me tell you a little bit more about the speaker we're going to have. Ariel Glucklich is a professor at Georgetown University, and he offers courses in Hinduism and also in the psychology of religion and the anthropology of religion. So he has many foci to his research. One is Hindu jurisprudence, and he's well published in that area, but he also publishes on religion and the body. And so the book that I know very well is called Sacred Pain. It's about religious experiences of pain. And I think in your talk today, you're going to be taking us into the new project, or the most recent project, which is about religion and pleasure.
Yeah.
So please join me in welcoming Ariel Glucklich.
Thank you very much, Amy, and thank you for the hospitality. I had a blast here today. It's first of all, it's a pleasure to be here, but mostly it's a pleasure to see this amazing campus. Both my son and daughter studied at U of O, so I've been there many times, and OSU is that other one. So this is really my first visit to campus, and it's so extraordinary. I promised myself to ask if anybody wants to switch with a Georgetown position. I'm game. You know, we don't have these trees, but you can see the Washington Monument from campus. I'd be happy to switch, so get in touch with me at the end. The other thing is, in Stuart's class, he was promoting this talk, and the way he was promoting this talk, I don't know if promotion or arm twisting is the term, but he said you get extra credit, a certain amount, a sliver of extra credit, but the sliver is significant. So those of you who are here for that purpose, and looking at a couple of the young folks here, I hope it's not too much of a sacrifice for that B+ to A- tilt. Okay, so I'll start. I apologize for reading. Usually I don't read in these lectures. I'm going to read today because it's new material for me. As I move from pain to pleasure, it's more enjoyable, but it is new, so I'm not perfectly oriented. The last several years, I've been working in a community, or with a community in the south of Israel, in the remote desert. I've been suspending my work in India and spending time there with a community that is as remote as any. in a part of the country that is as desolate as any. It's 120 degrees in the summer every single day, and there's nothing that grows outside of the community. It looks like a lunar landscape, and just merely going to work under those conditions is suffering. It's physical hardship. That's what I mean. It's extremely difficult. It is for them, for members of the community. There's about 200 folks there. And it certainly is for me, because it's manual labor and we don't do a lot of that. In fact, I've done all kinds of things. They have a date tree growth, so climbing date trees, milking goats, working in the kitchen, working in the garage, working with the kids, laying bricks on a path. I've fallen off of a forklift and torqued my back badly. This summer I fell off of a bicycle, which is more mundane, but tore several muscles, micro tears, nothing major. So while I really enjoy this work, I've paid a price for it, and I'm trying to fit that pain into the sacred pain scheme, and I cannot. So we'll see if we can integrate it with pleasure, and that'll be more satisfying. So, recent years have seen a proliferation of scholarly studies on the body in its cultural and religious settings. These can be divided into two broad categories. Studies of the body itself, be it in pain, disease, at war, on a gallows, the evolving body, and so forth. These studies inquire what sort of information the body provides and what causal factors explain how the body behaves in its many contexts. The second category encompasses the body in the mind. How does a given culture imagine the body? How does the body act as a trope? What are the many ways of inscribing and reading the body as culturally conceived? If one may generalize, the first category falls into biological, psychological, and anthropological domains of research, while the second is more literary and cultural and has included religious studies by and large. My own interest, as recorded in Sacred Pain and other writings, has been to examine the boundary between the two approaches. And so today, with a focus on the body in its pain as well as on its pleasures, I begin with a brief examination of these two broad approaches, and I will shorthand these as the quantitative approach and the qualitative approach. Now, given the wide and still robust prevalence of pain, both rituals and discourse, in religious life, what do we learn from quantitative approaches and what do we learn from qualitative approaches? A brief note on the terminology. The terms usually refer to research methodologies or modes of data gathering and analysis. For example, broader comparative data with statistically significant sample sizes based on questionnaires or observations tend to be quantitative, while long-duration observer-participant immersion in single communities tends to be qualitative. These two methods yield two different sorts of information, such as the role or function of a ritual in social organization or economy, on the one hand, and something more subtle, let's call it religious experience, on the other. So beyond the methodological assumptions, there's also a distinct substantive assumption or assumptions. The significant fact of particular phenomena are its social functions and evolutionary causes in quantitative analysis. These derive from the aggregation of bodies functioning in a causal environment. In contrast, the other assumption is of a mind or a self who interprets his or her world and undergoes authentic experiences that are never causally reducible to mechanical or biological antecedents. The religious ritual uses of pain have received a considerable amount of attention in both modalities, and I shall just give two examples of significant quantitative approaches to religion and pain. The first one is Harvey Whitehouse and his colleagues, and the other one is Richard Sosis. I will contrast these with my own qualitative approach and determine whether and how the two approaches can be combined with regard to religious pain. Now, Whitehouse is an Oxford University anthropologist. began his project with the ethnography of a millenarian cult in Papua New Guinea. And he subsequently divided religious groups into large and small-scale organizations and came up with a concept of modes of religiosity to characterize what he calls the doctrinal mode, with its routinized orthodox approach, in contrast with what he calls the imagistic mode, that has its own infrequent and arousing, often dysphoric or painful, rituals. Both modes are largely concerned with the transmission of religious information. Repetitive and doctrinal content passes via the first mode, and rare or climactic information via the other mode. In his work, Whitehouse is particularly interested in memory, which he regards as episodic for the doctrinal mode and schematic for the imagistic mode. You see, it is very jargon-laden, but the two types of information gathering correlate with two different types of ritual, the routinized ritual versus the one-time dramatic and painful ritual. The overall framework for this theorizing is cognitive evolutionary. How does one validate such theoretical claims? The large team that Whitehouse assembled employed a combination of quantitative measurements in widely distributed settings around the world, with attempts to measure more subjective, what he calls semantic, units of information. Now, to oversimplify, researchers apply semantic network analysis to questionnaire responses focusing on such features as degree centrality, that is the number of connections for a given concept, betweenness centrality, the direction from which connections derive relative to other terms in a network, and so forth. This leads to what he calls nodes, or concepts that figure prominently in the semantic network, the world of verbal responses, which enables a quantifiable measurement of meaning, that is what he calls qualitative data, in the information obtained from ritual participants. One of the researchers who joined Whitehouse's team doing research in Israel, incidentally, but who subsequently left, is Richard Sosis from Connecticut. Sosis has published highly cited work on painful rituals. His work has supported the familiar argument that ritual participation increases social bonds. According to Sosis, the mechanism is the trust and cooperation that develops between ritual participants who undergo pain. The toleration of pain acts as a costly signal of in-group commitment. The more painful or costly the ritual, the harder it becomes to fake the willingness to pay, and hence the signal becomes compelling or persuasive. This hypothesis can be tested in a variety of ways. For example, volunteers agree to play a common pool resource game, and the effects of the rite then emerge through self-reporting and behavioral measures indicated by answers to questionnaires addressing the game. Ritual populations are then measured against non-participants to measure whether there is significant improvement in the internalization of group ideology. The value of such work is considerable. At the very least, as Whitehouse puts it, it tries to transform subjective psychological states, pain, into data that can be used to support an evolutionary theory or thesis. Critics have noted several shortcomings, but I believe that essential elements of the religious experience of the body in pain are left out when ritual pain is understood as cost, as a signal, or as a mnemonic device, a mnemonic tool. In fact, the category of experience itself is left unexamined in the theoretical underpinnings of the scientific work here. It is not clear, for example, that responses to questionnaires are capable of revealing something as elusive as the meaning of pain when it serves the somatic linchpin of a religious experience. And if any of you who have done ethnographic study in a community for a long time and have actually visited with folks would know that questionnaires do raise questions of epistemology, not to mention ethics. In contrast to this method of gathering data, it took me 4 years of increasing familiarity with my subjects before the research itself on the subject of pain could actually begin. That is, before the deeper questions could be asked. Since the religious situations observed are often dysphoric or painful, one may wish to know what is the medium or long-range nature of the motivation that participants feel in relation to the ritual. Does this motivation change over time? And does it alter the way that the ritual's discomforts are evaluated? In fact, what are the effective responses to the hurting, and what sort of language do participants use to express this? While patients usually report pain as frustrating or depressing, religious actors may speak of pain as somehow rewarding or even satisfying. There's something subjective at work here that may help us understand the function of the rituals, but requires intimate phenomenology, which eludes questionnaires. In Sacred Pain, I argued that telic centralization, more jargon, telic centralization, is a way of strengthening a social and ideological connection, and that pain can serve such a positive purpose. That work was supported by literary and scriptural studies, and by second-hand reports from anthropological studies, but I needed my own field observations. Unlike the vast comparative studies discussed above, mine were narrow and of long duration in the culturalist mode. Culturalist mode specifically of Friedland and Moore. They were virtually biographical in their attention to the details of the subject lives, and I want to point out two foci for this research. The first one is that remote desert community that I mentioned in the south of Israel. It was founded by a teacher 25 years ago. Community is isolated, not to say secretive, and possesses an extremely strong work-based discipline that I hesitatingly call religious. The second focus is Bedouin pilgrims to Mecca, Bedouin pilgrims from Israel to Mecca. In both cases, research had been ongoing for years and has included close familiarity, indeed friendships, shared work, and the breaking down of barriers of mistrust. There's been very little questioning as a detached academic encounter, but a great deal of conversing, repeated over a span of years, and with permission taping, but the tape disappears after some time. Changes in the subject's attitudes and feelings, the internal contradictions and variations that the years have brought about, all of this have been observed and noted. Now, below is a brief summary of two subjects that I studied. The first one is a man called Alon. He's a 60-year-old man, married with 5 children. His body is slightly bent and arthritic, and his skin is sun-parched. He was a high-ranking officer in an elite unit of the Israeli army, and he holds a BA in philosophy from Hebrew University. He joined the groups that engaged in spiritual study under this charismatic teacher in Jerusalem in the 1980s. He was among those who founded the community. The name of the community, by the way, is neuro-psychology, and has always played a leading role in its management. I spent many hours conversing with Alon and countless hours working with him, often under a sizzling sun of 120 degrees. For example, laying bricks for a new sidewalk was the last thing I did before I had to rest my shoulder. The most trying, exhausting, and painful affair Alon has told me he had experienced in this community was a 10-year construction project of an enormous art center. The workers lacked expertise and experience, and most of them worked after their regular working hours, which began at 5 a.m. in the morning. And so they worked during the hottest hours of the day, and sometimes late into the early hours of the morning, only to rise up again before dawn and begin the routine work the next day. At times they physically collapsed from the heat and exertion, or worked with sprained muscles and dislocated backs. Here's a statement that he gave me. So we started pouring cement, and it was getting to be evening. There were numerous complications, and the hose was giving us problems too. It went really bad. At some point, I was so exhausted, I literally fell apart. I left the cement area, sat next to one of the buildings, and could not move. My whole body collapsed. This cement work, which ended late would mean 1 in the morning or 2 in the morning. You can't stop in the middle of cement work. Was an astonishing, crazy effort. This overexertion was one of the themes of our life during these years. So too was the theme of not keeping score of profit, fatigue, time, or how much or how little we slept. It wasn't even about testing your limits because you had no limits. The second example that I'm using here is a woman called Amna. She's a 66-year-old Bedouin woman who is married and also has 5 children. The youngest is a 23-year-old boy or young man who still lives at home with his older brother. Although some of Amna's children are married or college educated with middle-class jobs, her oldest son is a mayor. She continues to clean houses, just as she has done for the last 40 years. She carries on until she can afford to build those 2 homes for her unmarried boys and then marry them off. She suffers from arthritis, high blood pressure, bad back, bad kidneys, and chronically painful feet. 20 years ago, Amna turned to religion and became a devout Muslim. In general, in Israel, Bedouins have been rather secular until the last few years. Since she became devout, she's been to Mecca 14 times and performed the Hajj once, mostly by slow bus via Jordan. It's the only way to get to Mecca from Israel is via Jordan on a modest budget. She also fasts on Thursdays and never fails to fast on Ramadan, naturally, refusing even water on the hot days while working at her physical job. I've known Amna for about 20 years now and began discussing religion in 2001. So what can one learn about Alon and Amna's bodies in pain that cannot be picked up by a questionnaire or a quantitative approach? I believe a good deal. Neither one of those individuals would agree to discuss their inner world with a stranger, and neither one would reduce or even demean their worldview by filling out forms. Of course, that is not to say that the religious experiences of these 2 people, or anyone else, are so uniquely individual that they owe nothing to broader cultural factors, language, values, beliefs, and so forth, or perhaps even to universal psychological, biological factors. But in relation to painful experiences, something interesting has up to now evaded observation. Both Alon and Amna report a paradoxical evaluation or attitude towards their own body feelings, and this might not come up in a questionnaire unless the researcher is sufficiently close to these 2 individuals to look for this. For example, Amna tries not to complain about her back while she's at work, but I have seen her grab it, quietly groan, when she believes that she's not being observed. When directly asked about it, she assumes a stoic attitude and smilingly says, "What can you do? We all get old." Now, I've not traveled with her to Mecca, but I've heard a great deal about her trips from her. She has told me that her hurting during pilgrimage is different. She finds herself walking or standing for hours on bare feet in a hot and crowded environment, often nudged from behind around the Kaaba. And her reaction to that, this is what she said to me. She said, "My heart expands outwards and surrounds everyone there. We are all one, and I feel a deep joy just being there with everyone." So I asked, "But what about your chronic pain, your feet?" And she answers, "The pain is no problem. It's a sacrifice. It's an offering. I feel better about myself because I have it." Alon and his colleagues in Neotz Madar hold no theological beliefs, although they share a definite philosophy, although they deny this too, which resembles to some extent early Buddhist ideas about the self. In their community, they continue to undergo painful trials by means of projects that they periodically undertake beyond their daily work routine, often the hottest hours during the day. I mentioned my own sacrifices. They weren't sacrifices, they were hindrances, because I don't share their life altogether, although perhaps I will in time. The labor itself in the hot desert can be painful, hard on the knees, hot, tiring, frustrating, at times even humiliating. According to Alon, one must desire it, give oneself over to it, learn how to join is his term, the others, and how to go beyond individual comfort of interests and participate in something more important. There is no metaphysical reason for this, no God, no spiritual quest or sacrifice, according to him. But there is also no blind mechanical response to evolutionary forces that produces cooperation. What there is, instead, is a hyper-refined awareness of the individual ego, the community, and a torturous process by means of which one comes to understand the tricks that the ego plays and the role of the community as a sort of teacher, a mirror to see through these tricks. In that context, participation leads to liberation and joy. The hard work, once you fully attentively participate in it, is a source of profound satisfaction, precisely because it does not serve you and goes beyond your personal needs and desires. These accounts may seem extremely subjective, anecdotal even, although they are consistent with what I found in Sacred Pain. But I think they're also useful beyond biography. Can we place these bits of information into some scientific framework where they may complement the measurement of Whitehead's teams? Can they fill the qualitative gap in the quantitative agenda? I believe that the answer is affirmative. The paradoxical, enjoyable pain descriptions point to the nature of motivational states of mind when painful events take place in sacrificial, highly valued contexts, and they can systematically unpack the meaning of pain as cost concept that cultural evolutionary theories promote. This requires a proper method, and I suggest it now. Okay. I'm moving over to another section, the science of positive hurt. The McGill Pain Questionnaire is familiar to anyone who has gone to a pain clinic and was asked to fill out forms. The location and intensity of the pain are requested, but so are highly semantic qualities. There are over 70 terms that provided to the patient, and that he is to select the best descriptors for the nature of his pain. So there's terms like burning, throbbing, pinching, piercing, frightening, isolating, confusing, punitive, and so forth. There's 3 domains here: sensory, emotional, and evaluative. I've discussed the psychological and philosophical aspects of the semantic field in Sacred Pain, and there's no space for it here. But the researchers of dysphoric rituals, those who study in a quantitative way painful rituals, may wish to administer this questionnaire, in the local language of course, to ritual participants twice. Once before the ritual, in reference to medical or chronic pain that they might have, and then again after the ritual itself. It may prove instructive to compare the answers at all 3 levels, the sensory, the evaluative, and so forth, and measure the results. For example, someone like Amna may describe her backache as disruptive or frustrating in one context, but transformative and ennobling in a sacred context. Whether the pain would be described in the same terms on the sensory level is open to questioning, but the emotional and evaluative descriptions are clearly altered. Personally, I believe that the subjective reports on pain intensity would also be reduced. In other words, the pain would be felt as less aversive given the proper context. If a statistically significant population is measured in such a way and results are consistent with my observation of a small number of closely observed individuals, the researchers will be bound to explain the change. Why do sacred dysphoric rituals change the perception and evaluation of pain? And in fact, there is a hypothesis in place that might explain this phenomenon, and it was offered by the author of the McGill Pain Questionnaire, a Canadian pain specialist, Ronald Melza. The hypothesis, in brief, is the top-down or output-to-input neurological modulation of pain. The experience of pain, which depends on afferent sensory information processing, can be radically changed by sufficiently strong efferent, that is from brain to periphery, information. If the event that causes the pain is perceived and evaluated in a positive light, the pain experience will be formed accordingly. An example in Sacred Pain, and here's, you have 2 football players suffering the same injury. One's playing offense and he just scored a touchdown. The other one's playing defense and he was just scored on. And they both suffer the exact same trauma. They will evaluate and therefore experience their pain differently. In other words, pain is not purely biological, although the mechanism described is neurological, but it is psychological and cultural as well. A number of questions come up. If dysphoric rituals are socially useful and are valued, do they alter the experience of pain? Do pain semantics reflect these changes? What are the conditions that make this possible? That is, does one learn to respond to pain in more positive terms? Finally, because these rituals and their underlying purposes are valued, the participant is motivated to attain these experiences, and therefore we need to understand how motivational states of mind toward pain are cultivated in order to turn aversive ritual into appreciated experience. I'm arguing here that we should not expect the ritual subject would spontaneously value the ritual pain, but that they must learn to do so. This is a long duration process that precedes any single ritual and characterizes years of childhood and culturation. Given this assumption, we can put the matter in more humanistic and experiential terms. What are the contours of conscious experience when we look at people who sacrifice their body for some purpose? How do we understand their personal motivation, their idea of a goal and a path, the meaning of their actions and ideas, and their feelings of achievement, which is so satisfying to them? Finally, how did they come to acquire this complex attitude? So this is the remaining agenda for this paper. How does one learn to experience and describe aversive sensations in such a way that positive evaluations emerge from negative sensations? How does religious culture turn pain into satisfaction? The topic falls under the heading of my heading, there's no heading up there, of effective training. I'm going to take a second break and sip some water and grab some notes that are left out. My printer skipped a paragraph. I discovered it last night and wrote it down from memory. Okay. So pleasure, a universal human phenomenon that we all know or wish to know at first hand, is one of the most surprisingly elusive topics for systematic reflection. I can think of no other psychological fact that we get so consistently wrong in terms of confusing the thing itself with its causes and its true causes from false causes. Consider the following example. When Flaubert, who wrote Madame Bovary, wishes to describe the pleasure that his heroine experienced early on honeymoon, what sort of literary tools does he use? He's trying to describe her pleasure. So this is a quote. She thought sometimes that after all, this was the happiest time of her life, the honeymoon, as people called it. To taste the full sweetness of it, it would have been necessary, doubtless, to fly to those lands with sonorous names, where the days after marriage are full of laziness most suave. In post-chaises, behind blue silken curtains, to ride slowly up steep roads, listening to the song of the postilion re-echoed by the mountains, along with the bells of goats and the muffled sounds of a waterfall. At sunset on the shores of gulfs, to breathe in the perfume of lemon trees. Then in the evening on the villa terraces above, hand in hand to look at the stars, making plans for the future. Pleasure. What did we learn about pleasure from reading this? We learned that the most articulate of 19th century authors lacks the vocabulary to describe pleasure itself, and had to fall back, as we all do, on the objects that we perceive in our conscious mind when a very pleasant feeling permeates our body or our brain. What is the pleasure of an ice cream cone? Is it cold? Cold pleasure? Fatty pleasure? Sweet pleasure? I don't think so. These terms describe the perceptions that we have, or in ambiguous uses of the language, the properties of the object to which we attribute the pleasure. Unlike pain with its 70+ terms, no one has systematically collected true pleasure terms. Although, here I got a bracket and tell you this, that Ronald Melzack had a graduate student, doctoral student, God bless him. He decided if Melzack can do this for pain, I'm going to do this for pleasure. And he started with the orgasm. And so he came up with all these terms for orgasm. which he actually, believe it or not, managed to publish somewhere. And most of them read like paint. I don't know if you lack creativity or just never had an order. It's pleasure piercing, shooting, burning. Furthermore, when we attribute our pleasures to those linguistic objects present in conscious awareness, we err. I call this hedonic attribution error, and it is extremely pervasive. The true causes of pleasure are not the objects at all. The commonsensical approach to pleasure suggests a folk empiricism leading to the simplest view possible, the one that both Plato and Aristotle discounted in their own writings, that pleasure is the perception of something that makes us feel good due to its intrinsic qualities. There are several alternative theories. The Greek philosophers, for instance, insisted, Aristotle, that a perception of change in body states is necessary. It's the perception of change that accounts for the pleasure rather than the actual body states, and that some sort of evaluative criterion be applied to that change, for instance, as beneficial or contributing to a set goal. Biologists, especially evolutionary biologists and psychologists, now posit that because animals are also able to experience pleasure, the evaluative criterion that the Greeks insisted on has to be built in and genetically transmittable. On biological functionalist theories, pleasure is not caused by the object with which it is associated, but with the function of such objects and the responses to these objects in behavioral adaptation. The good feeling we call pleasure arose in evolutionary history in situations where adaptive choices had to be made and succeeded. When these choices enabled survival and reproduction, the capacity to have these feelings passed on to us, and these arise when similar choices are made. On the adaptive view, then, there are three types of pleasure, not sensory, intellectual, and so forth. The three types of pleasure are novelty replenishment, mastery, and exploration or play. Novelty replenishment pleasures are those derived from responding to novel situations, stressors, and returning to some sort of homeostasis. They are purely biological pleasures and roughly correspond with the effects of religious ethical system, with the affects that religious ethical systems tend to curtail. That is, enjoyments that individuals find irresistible, like sex, food, watching sports, and so forth. St. Augustine, perhaps most famously, regarded these as highly addictive. They represent what today would be called the hedonic treadmill, a term used to describe addiction to novelty pleasure worn down by habituation. Now, mastery pleasure, in contrast, is the satisfaction that one gets from mastering the organism's responses to the first set of pleasures. These are highly social and prized in religious ethics, and of course they are learned. Examples include learning to control emotions and desires, mastering the body in ritual or meditation, acquiring difficult skills, learning a sacred language, memorizing scripture, liturgy, becoming altruistic, controlling dietary and sleep habit, and so forth. These are all mastery pleasure. Mastery pleasure is not just accomplishing these things, but learning to enjoy the achievement of doing so. Finally, exploratory pleasures, such as play, take mastery for granted, or more precisely, they represent enjoyments that are untethered from need or addiction, but also from the constraints of the cultural agendas that underlie mastery pleasures. I'm going to stop reading about play pleasure. There's an increasing literature on that subject in the context of religion. There's long passages in Bella's new book on religion and evolution. And of course, Homo Ludens. Some of you are familiar with Homo Ludens as a basically book about play. So I'm going to leave play out of this. I'm particularly interested in mastery. Although religion in general and mystical traditions specifically appear to promote wholesale rejection of pleasure because they decry the corrupting effects of sensory pleasures, what they offer instead by way of austerities is in fact a sophisticated form of affective training. The control of the senses and emotions, the long vigils, the exhausting and even painful labor, all of these often attended by a discourse that is aimed against the body, are rather ways of turning novelty replenishment pleasure into mastery. For instance, the purpose of the Ignatian retreat or the training of a Buddhist monk is not aimed at eliminating positive feelings, but in fact to enhance positive feelings, empowerment, achievement, balance, self-possession, virtue as positive values and feelings. And these instigated or aroused by having freed oneself from the tyranny of external stimulation. It is not the mind or spirit over the body at all in practice. It is rather culture over nature. But the overall goal is joy. This is hardly esoteric or limited to religion. Paul Rosen at UPenn has analyzed the various techniques by means of which children learn to enjoy the sorts of food that, on first sampling, are highly aversive, disgusting, frightening, even painful. For example, the first taste of coffee, beer, wine, soda drinks even, is rather unpleasant. The first taste of spicy chili is painful. My taste of spicy chili just recently was painful. Thai restaurant. Raw fish may be scary or disgusting for children. There are several techniques for modifying the initial response and learning to enjoy these foods, and these include benign masochism, opponent process, taste masking, and other methods. The first of the three, to give just one example, benign masochism, is the realization that one is safe, that pain does not mean damage to the body. This is a cognitive tool, an assessment based on the ability to put the stimulation in a broader cognitive context. In order to do this, the young eater must be able not to ignore the organism's sensations, but to control its responses to them by adopting an evaluative delay in which other, acquired responses can be inserted. There is something of a risk there. Think of a roller coaster ride. Eating spicy food is initially risky at a young age, but the effective result is a feeling of empowerment, achievement, and a thrill of overcoming limitations. The reward, the good feeling, is not intrinsic to the act itself or to the taste, but to the social responses to a display of self-control, courage, forbearance. While physical acts might produce uncomfortable sensations, the overall experience may eventually be evaluated as highly pleasing in a rather complex way. There are psychological reasons for this. And here I quote a neuroscientist who talks about the positive social interaction as a stimulant for the same brain centers that are associated with reward circuits associated with pleasures. And I'm not going to read it because it's rather technical, but the point of this is that social reinforcement and acceptance, regardless of the pain that is required in order to attain that acceptance, produces highly registered responses in the brain pleasure centers. The basic mechanism that children develop lays the ground for mastery pleasure in its more sophisticated forms later in life. The positive affect is a mastery achievement feeling, and sometimes also the resolution of cognitive dissonance when there's a conflict between goal and response, when a conflict between goal and response is removed. The learning process that enables self-regulation is precisely the fine-tuning of such mastery, which is based on proper social reinforcement and is therefore neurologically rewarding even when the body undergoes pain. So this raises the issue. If successful, effective training depends on proper socialization and is a developed cultural product, why are painful rituals necessary for social cohesiveness? This is a difficult question, and it casts some doubt on the evolutionary theories that I've discussed previously. After all, in processing positive effect, the response to social reinforcement, the brain shows its indebtedness to evolutionary process that has already accomplished their work before the rituals have emerged in human history. So why do we need those painful rituals? I'm going to bracket that for now. It is probably safe to say that painful rituals work because of preceding affective training, whatever the function happens to be. Beyond that, there are simply too many conceptions of pain, too many ways pain has been articulated and experienced in ritual and discursive contexts as alchemical, punitive, healing, transformative, and so forth. And there are too many ritual scripts in which pain figures. I believe that we lose too much phenomenological texture by overplaying social integration, and this is where the voice of the individual participants is so useful. For example, I know from talking to her that Amna's pain in Mecca reminds her of her pain at home or at work, but not vice versa. She also enjoys the victory of overcoming her pain while on pilgrimage. She merely tolerates it at work. The reason she can actually celebrate her pain in Mecca is because she sees it as a sacrifice or an offering. Her feet are hurting there because she makes the choice to circle the Kaaba with thousands of others. She does not feel compelled by her religion. On the contrary, she experiences individual empowerment for having chosen to hurt in this manner. She thus feels validated, strong, generous, and even loving. Her pain is not a signal to others. She does not complain, but a signal to her own ego that the body has come under control for a higher purpose. It has been mastered. She experiences pain as a gift and feels good because she has trained herself or undergone lifelong training to do so. Now, on a comparative note, her accounts also remind me of E. Valentine Daniel's interviews with Hindu pilgrims. You might know this work. Pilgrims who describe their pain as turning into love when the pain reaches beyond a certain threshold. These sorts of accounts are invaluable to the researcher who wishes to understand ritual pain. The individual narrative puts into focus the subject's life outside of the ritual, her biography, and her affective training. Perhaps this data does not conflict with quantitative functionalist analysis, but there is the risk that it become impoverished by it. What I mean by this is this, that the key to painful ritual experience is the voluntary nature of the event. Ritual pain is not a toothache or a judicial punishment. It is only a ritual if the subject participates in it as actor, not as object. As ritual, it must be assented to. This assent, when extended to the hurting, is the key factor, along with earlier preparation and self-control. Due to this fact, the conscious state of mind must be part of the analysis. The phenomenology of ritual must include the actor's conscious reports, and that is what my book tries to accomplish. Thank you very much.